The one thing that I do know that gives me some hope is that, trans young people today get to see more trans elders than I got to see growing up, and they can't put that genie back in the bottle. Those relationships exist. We are one fabric, and we're sticking together.
Hello, and welcome to Out With It, the series by and for LGBTQ families. My name is Benjamin, and I am Family Equality's Multimedia Communications Associate. In January 2026, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in two landmark LGBTQ rights cases, West Virginia v. BPJ and Idaho's Little v. Hecox. Becky Pepper Jackson is a 15-year-old girl challenging her state's anti-trans sports ban, while Hecox is a college student challenging Idaho's 2020 ban on transgender athletes and requirements for sex testing. The two arguments were heard on the same day because they deal with very similar issues. BPJ is in high school, whereas Hecox is at the collegiate level. On Tuesday, January 30th, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the states in both cases. In their ruling, the court held that states have sufficient justification to ban transgender student athletes from participating on teams that correspond to their gender identity. This decision is devastating. And while it's limited to the context of sports and doesn't create a license to discriminate across all other areas of public life, it is still a clear and deliberate effort to erase trans people who simply want to exist in peace. So what does this mean moving forward? How will this impact the lives of trans youth? And what does it mean for the rights of the entire LGBTQ community? To help us understand this decision, we interviewed Sruti Swaminathan, who represented Hecox as a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, and Kevin Jennings, the CEO of Lambda Legal. Both the ACLU and Lambda Legal also represented Becky in West Virginia v. BPJ. As a disclaimer, we recorded this conversation before the decision was actually announced, so you might hear them speaking in hypotheticals, but I've edited out anything that doesn't apply to the actual outcome of this case. Moderating the conversation is Family Equality's incredible Senior Director of Education Law and Policy, Nikhil Vashi.
Hello, my name is Nikhil Vashi. My pronouns are they, them, and I am Director of Education Law and Policy at Family Equality.
Hi everyone, my name is Sruti Swaminathan. I use they and them pronouns, and I am a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV project.
And a proud alum of Lambda Legal, where I, Kevin Jennings, who uses he, him pronouns, am the CEO.
Awesome. Thank you both for being here with us today. So before we jump into the sort of legal arguments, I wanted to just start with the bigger picture. So Kevin, could you maybe just talk us through why has trans participation in school sports become such a national flashpoint?
Two things I would say. First of all, it's really important to understand this did not happen organically. Our
Hmm.
opponents did in-depth research to figure out which issues could most motivate their base. And they used that research to pick issues like young people in school sports who are trans as a way of motivating and ginning up their base to become more active in politics. So this is completely a cynical political ploy by groups like the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which, by the way, is the most misnamed nonprofit on planet Earth.
Yeah.
The second thing that is really important to understand is this is a solution in search of a problem.
Mhm.
Charlie Baker, the former Republican governor of Massachusetts, who's now the head of the NCAA, was asked under oath before Congress how many NCAA athletes there are. And he said there are about 450,000. Then he was asked how many of them were trans, and he said fewer than 10. So there is not some wave of trans people taking over sports in America that caused this to become an issue. It's being cynically manipulated by right-wing people for their own political ends.
Shruti, could you maybe walk us through a little bit about this case? Maybe specifically what happened to this young athlete, PPJ, that led to this lawsuit, and how it kind of went up the chain to the Supreme Court.
Sure. I think what Kevin left us with, that this is a solution in search of a problem, is a really great segue to talk about this case, right? So before West Virginia passed its ban, HB 3293, which prevents all transgender girls and women from participating in girls and women's sports in West Virginia. So before that law came to be, school sports were already sex separated. Boys were
Mhm.
prohibited from playing on girls' teams. Girls were prohibited from playing on boys' teams if a girls' team was available. And under a policy adopted by the West Virginia Secondary Schools Athletic Commission, trans students were allowed to participate in school teams consistent with their gender if their home school agreed. And if another school contested a student's eligibility to play, the WVSSAC would determine whether that student's participation threatened competitive equity or safety of other teammates. And, in
Mhm.
2021, HB 3293 overturned that pre-existing working policy and categorically banned trans girls and women from school sports. And West Virginia now claims that, its law reflects real biological differences between men and women with respect to athletic performance. But the largest known biological driver behind sex-based differences in athletic performance is circulating testosterone levels that typically diverge starting at puberty.
Mhm.
And this law excludes any consideration of hormones and ensures that transgender girls and women can never participate in girls' sports at any age or any level of competition. So, in June of 2021, Lambda Legal and the ACLU and the ACLU of West Virginia filed a lawsuit on behalf of Becky Pepper Jackson, our client, who at the time was just about to start sixth grade. And she was super excited to try out for her school's cross country team because she comes from a family of runners. Her mom's been running and running with her since Becky was about 2 years old. And so she was really excited to try out for middle school sports. And this law prevented her from being even able to try out. And so we filed a lawsuit and brought an as applied challenge, meaning the relief would only apply to Becky, who, by the way, is the only transgender athlete identified by the state of West Virginia from the start of this case till today, to whom the law even applies, which just underscores Kevin's point even further. And so in June of 2021, we filed this lawsuit and we filed claims under Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and moved for what's called a preliminary injunction so that Becky could try out for middle school sports during her sixth grade. And the district court agreed with us. They said Becky was likely to succeed on both her claims and entered a preliminary injunction that allowed her to play fall cross country. And because of that injunction, Becky was able to continue participating in spring track. She was too slow to make the team for running, so she picked up a new sport, shot put and discus, in the field events, and she loved it. She loved making friends. She loved getting the chance to just be a kid. And, West Virginia's argument here is that Becky's mere participation, even on a no-cut team like cross country, displaces cisgender girls. And I think what this really reveals, which is really important, is that West Virginia's real objection is to Becky's mere presence, regardless of any actual fairness or safety concerns. Becky has never experienced her endogenous puberty. She has gone through a typical female puberty and has known that she's the girl that she is for the majority of her life. And so for West Virginia to then come in and say, not only do you not get to do the thing you love, but we refuse to recognize you as the person you are, as the girl you are, an incredibly devastating thing for an 11-year-old to hear. And so, this case has made it up to the Supreme Court because the lower courts agreed with us that Becky has the right to play, and our opponents took this case to the Supreme Court because they want to do damage to the existing civil rights protections that affords people like Becky the dignity and the safety that they deserve in all contexts, including in school.
Wow. Wow. So, what really strikes me is, there's hardly any laws I can think of that apply only to one person. And, furthermore, if this young athlete Becky had just been born a few years ago, they would have been able to participate in their team potentially with no problem or controversy. So they've sort of been caught in this crossfire. Um, so West Virginia obviously has appealed the appeals court ruling where they agreed with your argument. So could you talk a little bit about what issue the Supreme Court took up? this case on, and what is West Virginia's kind of argument here?
Yeah, sure. So the Supreme Court granted certiorari in two cases, one out of Idaho and one out of West Virginia. In the Idaho case, which is about a college athlete student, there is only one legal claim at issue, which is under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In Becky's case, there are two legal questions, which is under Title IX and under the Equal Protection Clause. And so here, West Virginia and the federal government currently argue that the Equal Protection Clause and Title IX not only allow schools to categorically exclude trans girls and women from women's sports, but that the Equal Protection Clause in Title IX requires schools to do so. The Trump administration is currently using that argument to threaten to withhold funds from states and schools unless they agree to discriminate against trans girls through lawsuits against states and school districts. Like we said earlier, we obviously were not the ones who sought Supreme Court review here, and that's why the folks who are defending the law pushed for the Supreme Court to get involved here. Our position was that these aren't final cases, these are on a preliminary record, and that it was too soon to take up the issue. Yet, there's this false narrative that people defending the rights of trans folks have been the ones to propel this issue into court and into the court of public opinion when the opposite is really true. Why were these laws passed in the first place? They were passed in order to establish a principle in law and in public opinion that trans girls aren't the same as cis girls. And they were passed in order to leverage that into a rollback of rights of trans people more generally. And it's been a wildly successful strategy so far. So, our job here as Becky's counsel is both to defend the rights of her and kids like her to just be a kid and have the same opportunities in middle school and high school as anyone else. At the same time, our job is to make sure that regardless of what people think about sports, that it's not used in order to advance a broader attack on the rights of trans people, right? For example, what if the court says Bostock doesn't apply to Title IX? That's a big question coming out of this case. And, Bostock was the case that said firing someone for being trans is discrimination on the basis of sex. If they are right, if the Supreme Court buys into the argument that Bostock doesn't apply to Title IX, a principal could expel someone for being trans and it would not violate Title IX either.
Yeah.
People,
Wow. So sorry to cut you off there, but
no,
actually,
no,
I'm
don't
really
worry.
interested in this question about Bostock, and I would love to bring Kevin in
Yeah.
for his perspective here. As Sruti said, in Bostock v. Clayton County, it was the conservative Justice Gorsuch who wrote that discrimination against LGBTQ plus people is a form of sex discrimination under Title VII for the employment law context. Kevin, why doesn't this just resolve the argument in this case about Title IX?
Because our opponents won't let it.
Hmm.
I think Sruti made a really important point that we didn't pick this fight.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find hilarious is we're talking about misnamed people. The governor of West Virginia who signed the law, Governor Justice, who was not about any
Yeah.
justice, um, couldn't name a single trans athlete in his state when he signed the law and was asked by a reporter. I think what's really critical to understand here, some people have asked me, well, Kevin, if there's so few trans athletes, why are you putting so much time and energy into this case? It's for two reasons. First of all, every single of one of the 27 states that have passed a ban on trans athletic participation has gone on to pass other bans and
Hmm.
other restrictions on the rights of trans people. They use this issue to get their foot in the door. And once you say it's okay to discriminate in one realm of life, it becomes a lot easier to say, well, you can discriminate here too, and you can discriminate here too, and you can discriminate there. So even though this doesn't affect a huge number of people, the second reason we need to fight it is the principle that Sruti has mentioned that is at stake, the legal principle, two of which, Title IX, and also the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Um, Once you say that someone is not entitled to the equal protection of the law, you start down a very slippery slope. Where does that end? And I want to remind people of the signal victory that got us marriage equality in the case that ACLU and Lambda were both co-counsel in, Obergefell versus Hodges, was decided based on the Equal Protection Clause of the
Mm,
Constitution. Their ultimate goal is to say the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution doesn't apply to LGBTQ plus people, period.
wow.
So it's not only going to roll back things like the rights of trans athletes, it could even roll back things like marriage equality or Lambda Legal's 2003 victory in Lawrence versus Texas, which abolished sodomy laws. So the reason we have to fight now, and you'll figure out in a second that I started my career 41 years ago as a high school history teacher, so I often use historical analogies. Trans rights are Czechoslovakia. Gay
Mm,
and lesbian rights are Poland. And the Allies tried to appease Hitler in Czechoslovakia, and it didn't work. So we can't appease the bullies that are coming after trans people right now. We must stand up and fight because they're not going to stop once they win this case, or if they win this case. Um, they're just going to keep going and take away more and more rights from trans people. They've already proven they'll do that in 27 states. And then they'll go after rights for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people.
wow.
So our opponents have a long-term strategy. And if we don't cut it off at the pass, we're going to see some really awful downstream results.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I mean, so first of all, I love historical analogies too, and I think I love that one you gave. I'll match it with my own. I am of Indian heritage, and when a very small island of Great Britain that was not very powerful or rich compared to India, the way that they were able to take India over was because they pit individual Indian groups against each other based on religion, class, borders, and it just seems like, it's a playbook which seems to have been used over and over again. And, it's interesting because I just feel like we should be wise to it by now, but people need to learn from history. So yeah, you brought up the equal protection clause there, and Shruti, I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the argument that West Virginia is making that the law doesn't mention transgender people? The law is not discriminatory against transgender people. It doesn't mention transgender people. It applies to everyone equally.
I think we know that there's a lot of disingenuous
Yeah.
intent in that statement by our opponents. I think what's important here is that in one sense, this is a narrow case about sports, which is a pretty discrete context. But the real danger here is that the people who are passing these laws and defending these laws, they would love to use sports as a springboard for a broad decision that says more generally
Mhm.
that trans people don't have meaningful protections under the Equal Protection Clause or under Title IX. And, in the lower courts, in conducting its analysis of the constitutionality of West Virginia's law, the lower courts applied heightened scrutiny, recognizing that the law here imposes differential treatment on the basis of sex. But for Becky's sex, she would be allowed to participate on the girls' team, no problem, irrespective of this law, right? I think what Kevin said earlier is just a point I want to leave with, which, obviously this is about the targeting of transgender kids, and they're using this sports issue to jeopardize legal protections that extend far beyond trans kids. This law protects all women from government discrimination. And so, our opponents are framing Title IX as just about sports, but it does so much more than that. And that's
Mhm.
why we have to keep pushing back. As Kevin said, Lambda and the ACLU are the inertia against this government right now. And I think the physics of it all is very important. We have to keep challenging unconstitutional action by our government, regardless of whether we expect the outcome to go in our favor or not, because that pressure is important.
Yeah, can I chime in with two more additional points? First of all, their sudden interest in women's sports is quite surprising to me, given that they've done nothing to support the participation of women in sports by, for instance, offering equal funding to women's teams. So, speaking of disingenuous, the second thing is this focus on children is very strategic because the easiest way to panic somebody is to say they're after your kids. Supposedly, Jews drank the blood of Christian children. and
Mm.
that justified pogroms against Jews. Supposedly, the Roma stole children, and that's why they were put in concentration camps by the Nazis. Obviously, LGBTQ plus people have been accused of recruitment or grooming throughout history. They're picking on this issue because they know it's very visceral for people. Um, and, since he just passed away, I want to quote the late Congressman Barney Frank, who once said, Republican concern for children begins at conception and ends at birth.
Uh,
And that has
yeah.
been historically true. These are not people who are fighting for more funding for our public schools. These are not people who are fighting for more funding for women's sports. They are using this issue. They could care less about children or women's sports. They have a much bigger prize in mind, and that's the rollback of all the victories we have won over the last 50 years.
Yeah, I've always thought it is pretty odd that, when we're talking about children and the safety of children, that issues like gun control don't come up surface to the top, especially when that is unfortunately the leading cause of death for, people under 18 in this country. I think you make a good point in that it is all very selective. Like, I'd love to ask Justice who his favorite women's sports team is and why he supports them, and who his favorite players are. I doubt that he'd have much of an answer there.
Yeah, I think a large part of this conversation is to remind ourselves that this is about a large set of attacks focused on trans people, but with a much broader agenda. This is not just about our healthcare or what restrooms we use. This is about retrenching people in a way of what being a man, being a woman, and what a family can and should look like. And so, as terrible and as terrifying as things are, and if we end up in the scenario where the Supreme Court rules against us, we as communities are going to keep moving forward. We are going to keep reimagining what's possible for us. I think our opponent's strategy here is to debate our existence, and our ability to win in court and win in the legislatures is dependent on our ability to tell full and nuanced stories about who we are as trans people and about our lives and our care, to provide accurate information about our healthcare, to find more and more spaces for kids like Becky to feel safe, and spaces that refuse to legitimize a debate over our existence. And so, regardless of the outcome at the Supreme Court, the fight continues. As Kevin mentioned earlier, bringing history back, we've faced setbacks. We've lived through, decades of rational basis land post Bowers before Lawrence. Like Kevin and I, we are so optimistic, and we have a lot of fuel in our tank for post decision day because we know the fight is just beginning. And kids deserve better. These young people deserve better, and I hope that we're here. And the one thing that I do know that gives me some hope is that, trans young people today get to see more trans elders than I got to see growing up, and they can't put that genie back in the bottle. Those relationships exist. We are one fabric, and we're sticking together. And so it's a tough legal battle, but we've won tough battles before.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I really appreciate what you said about sort of like the battle is not going to end, even if there's sort of a negative outcome from this case. So, Kevin, I was just wondering if you could maybe weigh in a little bit. And, family equality, our audience is a lot of families, LGBTQ plus adults with kids, you know, thinking about these families, what maybe should they be prepared for day one of, maybe a more negative outcome in this case?
Well, I want to reassure families with trans or non-binary kids or parents who are trans or non-binary that, as Sruti just said, the ACLU and Lambda Legal has your back. We will not quit fighting despite any loss that we take. I love that Sruti used the word setback rather than loss, because we're not going to lose in the end. We're going to win, and we will stick with it until we win. You use the analogy of Bowers versus Hardwick and Lawrence versus Texas. For people who don't really know legal history, the first time the issue of laws that criminalize same-sex relationships was challenged before the Supreme Court was in 1986 in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick, which we lost. We didn't quit. We kept fighting. And 17 years later, we got back to the Supreme Court in Lawrence versus Texas, and we won. For younger people, I want to remind you that in the 21st century, it was still illegal to have a same sex relationship in 16 states. This is not ancient history. Um, so we expect we'll have setbacks. We know we will. And what we can reassure you is that we will not quit fighting and that we will keep going until we win. And if it takes 17 years or 70 years, we will keep fighting. I think the most important thing parents of trans and non-binary kids could do, should there be a setback in this case, is to simply remind these young people that, first of all, you love them, you value them, that their worth does not depend upon what 9 people in robes in Washington, D.C. have to say. Um, Secondly, I think it's really important to help them understand some of the history and understand that sometimes you lose before you win. And that one thing about the queer community is we are a resilient and determined bunch. We have faced hard times before. A lot of young people, obviously, they're not getting that history in their schools because of the Don't Say Gay or Trans laws that have been passed in multiple states. So make sure they know that there are organizations out there that are going to stand with them, they're going to continue to fight for them, that we have seen this movie before where we've had setbacks and we've come back and eventually won. And we are determined to make that movie again.
Do you mind if I'm just so inspired by what Kevin just
Yeah,
said, and
of
I just want to
course. Yeah.
remind folks, like the tides, they are changing. Look what we saw in Virginia this election, last fall. A candidate ran on an entirely anti-trans platform, and the voters were having none of it. We have the power to change things. It's true, we have a lot of work to do in bringing the public to meet us where we are and to understand who we are, and in general, both sides being open to new ideas. But in the meantime, states have flooded us with these bans. People are losing their fundamental rights, their health care, their right to free speech. I sincerely can't believe that most voters are wondering whether girls like Becky can play on the girls or boys track team. They're
Mhm.
they're worried about the affordability of their groceries and their health insurance and keeping their jobs. And so this case is so important to us, and we are vigorously committed to defending Becky, our client, and her rights. But this is about a 16-year-old girl who wants to play and just be with her friends. And so I would encourage people to zoom out a bit and, as Kevin said, spend time loving on the ones that you're able to take care of and protect, and remind in this moment that, we are not alone until the end, and it is long from the end.
Yes, that's incredibly important and inspiring, like you said, Shakti. Are there other protections outside of the federal context, anything that, parents could maybe look to in their communities and their states to, make sure that their kids are protected or even just get some support in navigating the new conversations that are going to come up in the wake of this decision?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that in states, the final say on state constitutions is the state Supreme Court. And both we and the ACLU have had some real success in arguing in state courts on the basis of state constitutions. We are suing in the state of Louisiana around access to health care for trans young people. And the state moved to dismiss the case, citing last year's decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in Scrimeti that access to gender affirming care was not protected in the state of Tennessee. And the judges in Louisiana, the state judges, said that's nonsense. We're the state of Louisiana. We'll rule based on our own constitution. Thank you very much. So that suit is proceeding. So we live to fight another day. Do I wish we could get a sweeping ruling out of the U.S. Supreme Court that covered all 50 states? Obviously. But if we don't, we will fight state by state by state. And I want to remind people that's what we did in marriage equality. We didn't go straight to the Supreme Court. We won in the state constitutional court in Iowa, for example, which was a Lambda Legal lawsuit. And we built momentum by winning in state after state after state after state. If we have to do that again to protect the rights of trans people, we'll do it.
The Trump administration has argued that Title IX not only, allows schools to exclude trans girls and women from sports, but require it. And that's a pretty aggressive argument to make when even the text of Title IX's regulations make even sex-separated teams optional, not
Yeah.
mandatory. And
Mhm.
even though no court has agreed with its position, the administration has gone around trying to enforce it de facto by holding funding hostage illegally. But the Solicitor General filed both an amicus brief and said at argument that the court should not reach that issue about what Title IX requires. So I don't imagine a ruling that says Title IX across this country requires exclusion of trans girls from sports in every context. I
Yeah.
think that's a question both sides have tabled for today.
So you actually Matt brought up a very good point though, Shruti, which is that there's a lot of pressure being put on schools, even outside of this case. And it seems like many schools are being forced to bow down to this pressure, or maybe even complying in advance just because they don't want to face that from the federal government. Kevin, can you think of any ways that, do you have, well, first, do you have anything to say to teachers, educators who are scared, who are thinking that they're doing the best by their community by just going with what the Department of Education is saying? Do you have anything you would like to them to specifically to know?
Oh boy, as a former teacher and a former assistant secretary of
Hmm.
education in the Obama administration, do I have something to say on this
Yeah.
subject? And I'm going to say, first of all, um, the people dismantling the US Department of Education do not care about our schools. Where, if they're really so concerned about opportunity in schools, where is the equal funding that schools need so they can provide quality education? I don't see them doing that. I see them dismantling the Department of Education. So, frankly, until they have a functional Department of Education and they fully fund public schools, they can take a seat. Now, to the parents and sorry, to the teachers, as a former teacher, and I helped students start the first GSA in the country at the school where I taught in 1988. I think it's really important to not give up your power. The, two things. First of all, you may be the only affirming adult in an LGBTQ plus young person's life. And we know from extensive research that that can save a young person's life. So you may be, one candle in a dark room can shed a lot of light. You may be that only candle for LGBTQ plus and particularly trans and non-binary young people. And I know as a former teacher, people go into teaching because they care about the well-being of young people. So don't surrender. The second thing is, if you are getting hassled, call us, call the ACLU. We will get you the support you need. We took 8,000 calls on our help desk last year at Lambda Legal from people who'd experienced discrimination based on gender identity, HIV status, or sexual orientation. All of them are fielded by licensed attorneys. So there are people out there who will stand with you. Don't forget that. I know sometimes it can feel really, really lonely, particularly, I'm also from Appalachia, as is Becky and her mom, Heather. I grew up in Western North Carolina. Places like that, it is tough to be a queer teacher or a strong ally teacher. But don't forget, you're not alone. And in the end, we do these jobs not for the magnificent pay we get, because you don't as a teacher. We do it because we really value and care about young people and continue letting your students know that you value and care about all of them and you don't restrict that caring or that valuation based on gender identity or sexual orientation.
That feels very important, and it does sort of underlie something that I think gets lost in some of the Supreme Court arguments. You're talking about support and affirmation, the recognition that somebody is a human being just like you. Is that sort of a core of what is going on here in terms of sports that's being missed here? Is it's not just about the ability to play. It's is it also just this ability to just belong and exist in the school environment.
Yeah, I think that in the end, what this is about is dehumanizing trans people.
Mm.
And once you dehumanize someone, it's very, very easy to mistreat them. So I think that we need to realize that that is the deepest agenda behind all these attacks. It's to dehumanize trans people. And as more and more Americans realize that trans people live next door, work in the next cube, go to school with them, et cetera, this series of lies that the far right is telling are going to fall apart. That's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen over time. And it's really, really critical that we create a space where trans young people can be free to be themselves. People have a right to be who they are.
Yeah. We've covered a lot here. It's been so great to have both of you and your perspectives. I was hoping to ask, and just in a way of closing out here, what is giving you hope right now?
I think it's the young people themselves, and honestly, it's the fierce parents who are mama and papa bears for their young people right now. I think for the trans and non-binary young people tuning into this, you are seen, you are so loved, you are so important. I can't imagine what it feels like in this moment to be bombarded with news and executive orders and legislation just contemplating your existence while simultaneously keeping up with schoolwork. And, Becky's a straight A student and does band and has all these activities going on, and she's the bravest person I know. And so I just want to remind young people that you are stronger than you even know during this incredibly scary time. And just remember that they can never stop us from being trans and being who we are, and we'll always find a way to carry forward. And I think one way we do that is to share our stories, including our joy. I think there's a bit of
Mhm.
a dearth of joy in the media scape right now. And I personally, I look in the mirror and I'm reminded of how much work I do individually to you know be safe in my body and to be who I am. And I feel so lucky to be a trans adult doing this work on behalf of other trans people. And so I'm just reminded daily of how our freedom and our defiance is so threatening to the fragile structures that seek to erase us. And so that won't be done. Kevin and I are here for you. Lambda and the ACLU are here for you, and to the families as well. Just thank you for being you, because I think that's what's gonna to propel us like forward is being in this together.
First of all, when somebody says something that you would have said, but said it better than you would have, you just say ditto. So
Uh-huh.
ditto to everything that was
Yeah.
just said. But in addition to the incredibly inspiring parents and young people that are standing up across the country, I do take a lot of solace from history. As I've said, we've seen really, really, really hard times before, but we don't quit fighting and we will win. So I know that we in the end are going to be victorious. I can't tell you when. Maybe it'll be a case 17 years from now, but we will not quit fighting until America is safe for everyone, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary at Lambda, and I spent the year asking young people, where do you want to be in 50 years? And the best answer I got was from a 17-year-old girl who said, oh, I hope people are studying coming out in their history class because the concept has gone away because people were always free to be who they were. I love the idea that in 50 years, coming out will be obsolete because people have always been free to be themselves. And you may hear that and you may giggle and you may laugh, but when Lambda Legal was started in 1973 and it was illegal to be gay in 43 states, our founders envisioned that not only would we stop being outlaws, we would win marriage equality and become in laws. And in fact, they did it. We've done it before, we can do it again. That's the lesson of history.
Well, both of you amazing advocates give me hope, and I hope that this also gives hope to the all of our families listening in. Thank you again so much, Shruti and Kevin, both being here and the work that you do.
Well, we are both grateful to be here. especially because Family Equality is such an important organization. You can't say this, but I can. Go to their website and make a gift now.
Thank you.
Another plug to reach out to the ACLU and Lambda with any questions during this time. We're here for you, and we are family in this fight. So thanks for having us.
Knowing now what the Supreme Court decided, I'm thinking about a recent report from the Williams Institute, which said that over 382,000 transgender youth live in one of the 29 states that have enacted laws restricting access to school sports for transgender students. And many of these states are strengthening or creating new bans on trans students' participation in sports. So, for the second half of this episode, I interviewed Chris Mosier, the first transgender athlete to represent the United States in international competition, the first transgender athlete in the ESPN body issue, and the first transgender athlete to be sponsored by Nike. Chris is also the first transgender athlete to qualify for the Olympic trials in the gender they identify. He's an incredibly accomplished athlete and overall just a really wonderful person, and I'm so excited that he spoke to me today. So without further ado, here's our conversation. Chris, how are you doing? How are you doing more generally? How are you doing amidst these two cases that are being heard? What's been going on in your world, and how are you feeling?
Yeah, I think I think for the last year that question has had a little asterisk next to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you feeling, all things considered, right? Like the world is burning around us, but how are you doing today? Like it in my day-to-day, I'm trying to lean into a very joyful June. I'm trying to prioritize joy and community and relationships and having a pretty good time, all things considered.
Yeah, fair enough. We do what we can. I know that you were involved in extracurriculars when you were younger. Before you began your professional career, you were already doing a lot of sports. Can you talk a little bit about what it meant for you to have access to those extracurriculars? What it meant for how you connected with your community, how you built relationships with team members, how you felt about yourself? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, sports was everything to me as a kid. And mostly I think it just came out of being a kid and playing, right? So playing outside like all summer long, all winter long. I had the biggest backyard in my neighborhood, and it was the central hub. It was the t-ball, soccer, dodgeball, whatever we were doing was happening in that place. And it was such a blessing to have a space where neighborhood kids could gather and I could be included. And what I found at a very young age was that the validation that I was seeing other people in my class get in the classroom or in the neighborhood uh, was foreign to me. I didn't experience that in the same way. But on the sports field, whatever the sport was, that was the space where I found was the sort of equalizer for me, where I was on par with my peers or even above them. That was the space where I felt most validated, most accepted, most welcomed, which might sound odd to people today, like thinking about how hostile sports has become for young people, and particularly for young queer and trans and non-binary people. So that was really the space where I found not only my friends, my family, my community, but also really my sense of self. I found my confidence. I found my own personal strength and my identity through sports. And so I know that that's such an important space for young people to have access to because it can, in its best cases, provide all of those things to all young people.
Definitely. I feel like that kind of confidence, that's where so many people learn what it means to be part of something bigger for the first time, and where they learn how to depend on other people, on their teammates. And it can be huge developmentally.
Yeah, and for me, really, when I think about it a little more deeply, it was really about
Mhm.
freedom, right? It was about freedom to fully be myself because the ways that I expressed myself and, like kind of going up through middle school, high school, the ways that I expressed myself through clothing or my mannerisms or my, like how I was navigating the world, I was able to do that more safely through sports because sports provided a shield. So sport and being on, even though I was on a girls' team, I was still able to wear baggy shorts and a baggy sweatshirt because that was part of sport culture. And while that was not widely accepted in my high school for quote unquote girl culture, right? So I was able to experiment with how I express myself and to find that sort of comfort in what really felt authentic to me because I was an athlete. And I think that that just opened up doors for me for, going into adulthood and into the rest of my life to, as you said, build that confidence and to also understand that I don't have to be middle of the pack or I don't have to be mediocre or in a more like outside of sports world, I don't have to just fade into the middle. And I think so much about our world tells us that we should just conform, that we should just, fall in line. And in sports, you are trying to be the best that you can be. So it really provided me a different perspective on freedom and choice and expression.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Jumping forward to the future a bit, a lot has changed in the last 15, 16 years since you first came out. Or even since I know you created the website transathlete.com in 2013. And it's hard to believe that 13 years have already passed since 2013. How do you feel like the culture or the conversations that you're having around being a trans athlete have evolved? Do you feel like we've made progress? Where do you think we've gone? How do you feel like things have changed in the last 15, 16 years?
Yeah, so much has changed since I came out in 2010. Just celebrated 16 years on T and 16 years of officially being out, and it has been not a full circle, but it's been a swinging pendulum, let's say, right? In 2010, when I came out, I was explaining to people what it meant to be trans. I was one of the first people that anyone in my circles had met, whether it was my straight and cisgender triathlon team, or even in the LGBTQ league that I was playing in New York City. There weren't a lot of trans people in the sports system and ecosphere at that time. And in 2013, started to sort of build some momentum. And that's when I created the website, but mostly out of a means to try to leverage my advocacy to, leverage my personal struggles to be able to help other people. Every situation that I was coming out in, I was the first one, and I was helping create policies, and I was trying to make it so that I would be safe to use the restroom or use the locker room or have access to participation. And I wanted to make sure that it was easier for everybody who came after me to be able to do that. So that was the founding of the website. And I was able to take policies that were already out there and go to other organizations and say, hey, Ultimate Frisbee has this amazing policy. Maybe this would work for your sport as well. And that was sort of building that momentum of policy change. And we saw it really kick into effect in about 2014, 2015, 2016. More states started to get policies for the high school level. More colleges and universities were creating policies. The NCAA had a policy. The International Olympic Committee had a policy. And in 2015, I challenged that International Olympic Committee policy to create a more pathways and better access for trans people. And that policy was changed as a result in 2016. So that sort of momentum, when you have the Olympics at the highest level of sport saying trans people should be able to participate, we saw more and more organizations create these policies. And then at the same time, we were seeing marriage equality passing and these anti-LGBTQ organizations that just had a ton of money to throw at discrimination. And they were looking for the next place to pivot to. And so they tried bathrooms, that didn't work. They tried locker rooms, they got a little traction. They tried sports and found the winning formula for them. So we saw more states, more organizations have policies through the 2010s. And when we got to 2020, we started to see our first anti-trans sports bans come into law. And with that, with Idaho passing HB 500 in March of 2020, that was the first domino to fall. And the following year, we had 8 or 9 more states. And since then, we're now up to 27 states in our country have a ban through law for K through 12 students, high school students from playing sports with their friends 29 states in total have some sort of these anti-trans bill, law, or policy banning trans kids, which equates to over half of transgender youth in our country now being not able to participate in school sports with their friends. And, so I think we've seen the progress to 2015, 2016, the sort of backlash from that progress. And then not even really backlash, but just the pinpointing of this as a political topic that will move voters and spark a lot of emotions in people. Because, the truth is, there haven't been new studies, new data, any influx of transgender people in sports that would have warranted this sort of response. And certainly wouldn't have warranted this level of obsession that we're seeing about transgender people participating in sports. So, it's been wide ranging throughout my time, and I think right now, while we have a greater awareness of transgender people, what it means to be trans people in sports, we are suffering from the impacts of the rhetoric that has been spread about trans people. Because when we have politicians even introducing bills, even if they never become law, we see that the way that everyday people in our society think about, talk about, and treat the trans community changes, and it changes negatively against us. And so we are fighting not only the myths and misinformation, but also fighting for our right to exist right now in and out of sports. So we are at this point at which I hope is like the peak of the pendulum before it swings back the other way.
Definitely. That's really interesting. That's something that came up in our conversation with Shruti and Kevin, just how there is absolutely no data backing this rhetoric. And it is ultimately, more than anything, a communication strategy. And the fact that it is about children or about protecting the children, which is a refrain we hear so often in so many oppressive movements throughout history, is what makes it so effective and what gets folks so riled up about it. I also think about how so much of this is recent history, and so much of this is about clearing a path forward, and so much of your career has been about clearing a path that simply wasn't there before. Speaking of being the only one in the room, I thought it was really interesting that BPJ was the only person identified by the state of West Virginia who would be impacted by this law. And that feels emblematic to me of something bigger. What do you feel like are the impacts on trans youth when they see that there is this sort of hyper focusing on one individual's ability to play sports at her school? Obviously, I know that the implications of this case will reach far beyond the decision itself, but there's a lot of attention on trans youth, and that's a lot to carry as a young person.
Yeah, that's right. We will definitely see the impacts of this well beyond West Virginia and well beyond BPJ. Uh, but I think about being a young person, right? Being now a high schooler and having to deal with being a high schooler in the age of social media, which I did not, fortunately, have to deal with that. But as an adult, I deal with it all the time, and I know how toxic it can be, and I know how horrible of a place social media can be if you are quote unquote other. And I think about being a young person, just trying to survive high school, just trying to understand your sense of self, and then being thrust into a national and global stage. And the ways that she has been able to navigate this, it's been really interesting to see her come into her power as a young person to use her voice. I had the good fortune of awarding Becky an award at the A for TE dinner a couple of months ago, and getting to spend some time with her and her mother. And she's just a phenomenal young person. She's joyful, she is sassy, she is fun, she is like just a great kid. And to think about having to hold this level of weight on your shoulders is just beyond me. Like, you are right. I have been a first in many different areas in my life, and those have come in my adult life. And being thrust into the national stage or the global stage, I had a global Nike campaign, and there were FCC reports, made about the commercial that I was in because I had my shirt off, and the sort of like offensive comments that come as in being in the spotlight. And we're holding Becky right now in this position of really being a beacon of hope, and that's a lot of pressure for a young person. So, I think it's really amazing the courage, the level of clarity that she has about herself, and the confidence is really tremendous. And I more than anything hope that our community of queer people and allies can really hold her and support her through this decision, because not only is this a personal decision, or this is a personal impact on her and her ability to participate, but also knowing that the outcome of this is going to influence how so many other people is a lot of pressure. And I think, you know, zooming out from Becky, just to be a young trans or non-binary person right now and to hear all of this rhetoric, this negative commentary, lawmakers, quote unquote, debating whether or not you deserve to have access to a bathroom, to the classroom, to content that actually speaks to your identity or your family, it's devastating. It's heartbreaking. It's so much pressure. And I would say that even as an adult, right, it's overwhelming because it is such a constant negative stream of information, lies, misinformation about us, about our families, about our loved ones. And I think more than anything, we need our community to come together and hold one another as we go through this, because we don't know what the outcome will be at this moment in time, right? But we know that it will have profound impacts on not just West Virginia and Idaho, but also across the country and around the world, in not only in sports, but in the way that trans people are treated in other areas of life.
Yeah. What do you feel like is the most important thing that families and communities can do to take care of trans youth right now?
I think the biggest thing is maybe a simple thing, but it's to shower them with love. I think like in a world where you wake up every day and the first thing that you see on the line is a news story about our rights being taken away, and or a member of our community being killed. You see negative and misinformation on social media, memes and jokes. And, we are constantly being put into a position where we have to defend our identity or are questioned in our identity. And this, I will say, is something that has not changed over the last 16 years of me, being out. That this has been a constant, and it shouldn't be this way. My hope would be that it would get better over time. And we, as a community, as people in this world, have the opportunity to make it better. When young trans people have a supportive person in their life, they are 40% less likely to experience ideations of self-harm. Like one supportive person can make that big of a difference. So this is something that we can all do, acknowledge and support and love on the people that are in your life, because they're not getting that from the people who are supposed to be protecting them. And adults should not be our young people's biggest bullies when they're growing up.
As I mentioned before, a lot of the folks listening are LGBTQ plus families. They are trans parents. They are folks who have trans children. In speaking directly to them, what do you want to make sure they know amidst this uncertainty and this onslaught of really violent and damaging rhetoric?
I mean, I think that so many people say this all the time, but trans people have been here forever. We will continue to be here. And we have a long line of transcestors who came before us, right? Who have laid the pathworks for the pathway for me to walk so that I can create pathways for other trans and non-binary people in the world. And we will continue to be here. We will continue to show up. And we have always found a way. So I think more than anything, it's just really important that we lean into our own personal power, that we do what we can do in our circles of influence, because, I can write to my lawmakers, and we should write to our lawmakers and do all of those things. But, I'm not changing their minds by myself. That happens because we all decide to take that action. But what actually does move people is the heart-to-heart conversation that we have at the grocery store or at the restaurant or at the family dinner table. at the workplace, right? It's sharing our stories, not just the doom and gloom, but the joys that we experience, how amazing it is to be a trans person right now, right? Like it's tough, like no lies, but I love being trans. I think being trans is absolute magic. And like leaning into that magic, especially right now with one another, that's how we create change in the world.
Lean into the magic. I love it. Is there anything else you want to make sure folks know before we sign off?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I'm really proud of being a part of right now is a new book that came out in January called Fair Game: Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. And oh, I might have it right here. So in this book, we interview 20 transgender athletes ages 8 years old to 59 years old. And we talk about their experiences in sports, positive, negative, neutral, the joys that we find. And so many of the stories that have come out about us recently, like, are talking about us, but not talking to us. And in this book, we really wanted to give trans athletes their voice and their platform for their voice. This has been something that is so important to me. As I'm just one trans person. You meet me, you've met one trans person. I can't speak on behalf of our entire community, but I can use my platform to uplift other voices, and that's what this book does. So in it, we bust 4 major myths about transgender athletes through the stories of real people. So it gives the human perspective, our voices, but also real tactical ways to combat things like, is it fair? Is it safe? Like what to say to people. So I would recommend that folks check that out. It's available everywhere. Fair Game: Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports. And then I hope that people will connect to me online. I'm here as a resource for families, for young people. I've mentored hundreds of families and trans athletes throughout my time of being out and open. And I hope that I can continue to do that and just be a support system for folks who are looking for ways to continue to experience the joys of sport that we all deserve and should have access to.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really grateful that we can share this resource with our families, and I feel like this is going to mean a lot to many people. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for all you do. Appreciate it.
This is a setback, but we faced setbacks before. Now is the time to step up and take action to support trans youth. Pick up a copy of Fair Game. Join Family Equality and Lambda Legal and others for a rally in your city, and check the description of this episode for more resources from the ACLU and Lambda Legal. And as Chris said, shower trans kids with love. We need to come together to support our community more than ever. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time. This has been a Family Equality production. As a leading national organization for LGBTQ+ families, we work to advance equality through advocacy, support, storytelling, and education to ensure everyone has the freedom to find, form, and sustain their families. Today's episode was produced by the communications team, and our music was designed by the incredible Michael Koppelman. Be sure to follow @Family Equality on socials for up-to-date resources, community events, and ways to get involved.